Dobrze, to będziemy zaczynać. Także witam Państwa na drugim webinarium, które organizujemy w tym roku wraz z firmą SmartBear. Poprzednim razem skupiliśmy się na produktach z rodziny Test Complete. Dzisiaj opowiemy Państwu o rodzinie ReadyAPI. Także dzisiaj będą miały dla Państwa mówić przyjemność dwie osoby. Ja nazywam się Michał Schubert, zajmuję się doradztwem i sprzedażą oprogramowania w Connect Distribution, a także jest z nami Joseph Joyce, Solutions Engineer ze SmartBeara, który pokaże Państwu produkt i opowie o tym produkcie od strony technicznej. Mamy na dzisiaj przewidzianą taką agendę, także na początku powiem powiem kilka słów o dystrybutorze Connect Distribution, przedstawię także firmę SmartBear. Następnie zrobimy prezentację narzędzi ReadyAPI i live demo. Tą część poprowadzi Joseph Joyce ze SmartBeara. A na koniec przewidujemy, mam nadzieję, że aktywną sesję Q&A. Dobrze, firma Connect Distribution. Firma została założona w roku 1998 roku, czyli już tak można powiedzieć, że przy początkach branży IT w naszym kraju. Jesteśmy dystrybutorem z wartością dodaną, czyli Value Added Distributor. I te brandy, które Państwo widzicie, te marki, które widzicie, wspieramy swoją wiedzą ekspercką, wiedzą techniczną, którą wykorzystujemy po to, żeby Państwu pomóc w przypadku właśnie wdrożeń, przeprowadzić szkolenia, czy przeprowadzić różnego rodzaju prezentacje produktowe, czy webinaria, takie jak tu widzimy. Mamy 4 biura, z czego 3 są zlokalizowane w Polsce. Siedziba główna jest w Warszawie. Mamy jeszcze jednostki w Krakowie oraz w Bielsku-Białej, a także firmę siostrzaną w Lublianie na Słowenii. Działamy w 4 obszarach, tak jak Państwo tu widzicie. Jeden obszar to jest bezpieczeństwo, także w branży storage'owej, części storage'owej, w narzędziach deweloperskich, a także systemy operacyjne i bazy danych. W przypadku części tej security mamy tutaj dosyć sporo obsadę, dużą reprezentację, począwszy od narzędzi do zarządzania hasłami, jak i zdalnych resetów haseł, przydatnych właśnie w dużych organizacjach, narzędzi o typu PAM, czyli Privileged Access Management, zarządzanie prawami dostępu, narzędzia do zdalnego dostępu do zasobów sieciowych, czyli wykorzystywane często właśnie w home office, teraz wciąż są mocno popularne. Ciekawe narzędzia do multiscanningu i sanityzacji, czy narzędzia do skanowania plików, czy danych przychodzących, wychodzących wieloma silnikami antymalware'owymi i także oczyszczania z potencjalnie niebezpiecznych zawartości tych plików. Te narzędzia są chętnie wykorzystywane przez organizacje, które mają swoje wewnętrzne, wyizolowane, odseparowane od internetu sieci. Także mamy fajne narzędzia do typu skanery podatności, zarówno dla aplikacji instalowanych na komputerach, serwerach, jak i dla aplikacji działających w sferze webowej, a także do tworzenia, do robienia także na nich testów penetracyjnych. Narzędzia także do monitoringu infrastruktury, a także różnego rodzaju firewall, next generation firewall, web application firewall, a także ciekawe narzędzia do zdalnego przesyłu plików, takiego bezpiecznego przesyłu plików, tak żeby po prostu nikt niepowołany na tych danych nie położył swoich rąk. W części storage'owej mamy ciekawe narzędzia właśnie typu hiperkonwergentnego, dosyć trudne słowo, także narzędzia do wirtualizacji aplikacji VDI, do wirtualizacji środowiska Windows na Macach, narzędzia do zarządzania wydrukami, drukarkami w dużych, rozproszonych środowiskach wielooddziałowych, a także narzędzia do przywracania danych, zarządzania właśnie do przywracania danych, czyli typu disaster recovery, tutaj zaznaczam, że to nie jest backup, to jest troszeczkę inne ujęcie tematu, a także narzędzia deweloperskie. Tutaj możemy powiedzieć, że możemy zarządzać takim pełnym cyklem życia produktu, właśnie od tworzenia kodu, pisania kodu w różnych środowiskach i językach kodowania, następnie poprzez testowanie, konteneryzację, zarządzanie tymi kontenerami, tworzenie wersji instalacyjnych, czyli już taki ostatni krok przed wypuszczeniem produktów na rynek. Także ciekawe narzędzia zarządzania projektami, zarządzania także właśnie tworzeniem projektów, monitorowaniem projektów, a także mapy myśli, rozrysowywania graficznie swoich pomysłów i dróg dojścia, czyli to są narzędzia typu od Mind Managera, a także systemy operacyjne bazy danych. Tu mamy reprezentację MySQL, Oracle'a i SUSE. To przejdźmy także teraz sobie do bohatera dzisiejszego spotkania, czyli firmy SmartBear. Firma założona w 2009 roku i działa bardzo, bardzo prężnie. Wstrzelili się w bardzo dobrym momencie na rynek z bardzo dobrym produktem, w momencie dużego zapotrzebowania na tego typu produkty. W obecnej chwili mają 12 biur na świecie i tutaj co ciekawostka jest także biuro zlokalizowane w Polsce, biuro deweloperskie techniczne. Mają 15 milionów aktywnych użytkowników, ponad 24 tysiące zadowolonych klientów w takim ujęciu korporacyjnym, 3 narzędzia open source i te narzędzia są wykorzystywane obecnie w 194 krajach. W ogóle misją SmartBear jest to, żeby być takim pierwszym wyborem dla grup deweloperskich do tworzenia takich jak najlepszych narzędzi jutra. Firma SmartBear stale rozwija swoje narzędzia, jak i także wprowadza do rodziny inne zewnętrzne narzędzia, właśnie tak między innymi w ostatnim czasie właśnie do rodziny SmartBear dołączyły narzędzia Swagger, następnie Cucumber. W tym roku także dołączyły narzędzia Własne, czyli narzędzia do typu App Stability, Error Monitoring. Tutaj jeszcze chcę powiedzieć, że to jest w ostatnim czasie także rodzina ReadyAPI została wzbogacona o wsparcie dla popularnej platformy strumieniowej Apache Kafka. Także w tym roku firma SmartBear zdobyła nagrodę Davis Award na Developer Week, a także ciekawą, fajną nagrodę przez organizację IoT Breakthrough, czyli narzędzie Internet of Things Developer Tour of the Year 2021. I także firma SmartBear, co ciekawe, zdobyła drugi rok z rzędu. Także to już ujęcie nieproduktowe, tylko bardziej ze spojrzenie na zasoby ludzkie w firmie, czyli jedno z najlepszych miejsc pracy w Bostonie za rok 2020 i za rok 2021, czyli 2 lata z rzędu. Firma zdobyła także zaufanie różnych firm, zarówno dużych, jak i małych na rynku, we wszystkich sektorach gospodarki. Także Państwo widzicie, od serwisów finansowych, technologię, przez edukację, media, wytwarzanie różne, czy narzędzi, czy firmy zajmujące się sprzedażą detaliczną. Tutaj mamy w ujęciu takim światowym, jakie są takie przykładowe właśnie tutaj firmy referencyjne. Natomiast chcę powiedzieć, że jeśli użytkowników programu produktów SmartBear moglibyśmy spokojnie taką listę zapełnić logotypami polskich organizacji. Firma nie zapomina także o community, są bardzo zaangażowani w open source. Dostarczane są właśnie na rynek narzędzia 3 open source'owe, między innymi właśnie jest to Swagger, czyli narzędzia do projektowania API, SoapUI, narzędzia do testowania API oraz narzędzia Cucumber Open, narzędzia dla rozwoju sterowanego zachowaniem, czyli Behavior Driven Development. A jeśli chodzi o takie ujęcie produktowe w spojrzeniu takim, gdzie te narzędzia, w którym momencie tworzenia aplikacji narzędzia SmartBeara mogą być wykorzystywane, także jak widzimy tutaj od samego początku, czyli poprzez projektowanie, poprzez współpracę właśnie z narzędziami typu Continuous Integration, Continuous Delivery, poprzez testowanie, zarówno w ujęciu UI-owym, jak i API, deployment, a także na koniec monitoring tego, co się dzieje, jak te narzędzia działają i poprzez później wszelkie przeglądy kodu, zarządzanie poprawkami, wdrażanie tych poprawek. Także pełny cykl życia właśnie tutaj takiego tworzenia aplikacji i API. Firma zdobyła także bardzo duże uznanie analityków branżowych, jak i klientów. Także często właśnie tutaj w pracy takiej handlowej spotykam się z pytaniami, jak firma wypada w przypadku właśnie takich organizacji oceniających, jak to wygląda w Forresterze, jak i w Gartnerze. W każdej z tych organizacji oceniających firma wypada bardzo dobrze, bardzo wysoko, w ścisłej czołówce. Często właśnie jak jest ten magiczny kwadrat Gartnera, to tutaj możemy z dumą powiedzieć, że firma SmartBear jest w absolutnej czołówce tego typu rozwiązań testujących i automatyki testowej. I firma także dostaje często szereg nagród i właśnie w zeszłym roku dostaje nagrodę takim wyborem klientów Customer Choice w zakresie zarządzania pełnym cyklem życia API, czyli właśnie tych produktów, dzisiaj będziemy więcej mówić. I tutaj, jeśli chodzi o taką część wstępną, z mojej strony już będzie wszystko, także zapraszam także na część techniczną, o której opowie Joseph Joyce, z firmy SmartBear.
Hi everyone, good to be with you all this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you're joining from. Let me just go ahead and start sharing my screen. As Michael said, I'm a solutions engineer with SmartBear, so I spend most of my time doing demonstrations of our applications, mainly on the API lifecycle side, and number one, helping teams understand if ReadyAPI or Swagger Hub, which is the other tool that I would support, helping teams find out if the tools are the right tools for them. And if the answer is yes, helping them make the best use possible out of those tools. So helping with onboarding and training and that type of thing. But today we're talking about ReadyAPI, which is SmartBear's API testing platform. And Michael has already given you some information about the platform in terms of what it can do, but I'd like to talk about it in a little bit more detail, and specifically in terms of how ReadyAPI can be leveraged by developers as well as testers, because quite a few teams that use ReadyAPI are using it from different angles, shall we say. Primarily, we have testers who would use ReadyAPI in the past, coming from SoapUI open source, which is the tool that ReadyAPI evolved from. But more and more frequently, we're seeing developers start to bring ReadyAPI into their workflows when they're building APIs, whether they're REST or GraphQL or IoT types of interfaces. And you can see here on the slide, ReadyAPI supports multiple types of protocols. So ReadyAPI can test your SOAP and your REST services, of course, but it can also test GraphQL, MQTT, JMS, which makes it quite useful for developers who are working with several different types of protocols. And another important point about ReadyAPI is that it's not just a functional testing tool. There's a functional testing component, there's a performance testing component, a security testing component, and also an API virtualization component. So it's feature rich, and you're going to be able to use it for more than one type of task as a developer or a tester, right? Whether it's functional, security, or performance tests. And then test creation always happens inside the application, which we'll see in a minute. When I open it up, you'll get a look at how the kind of test creation process looks like. But test execution and test automation, that can be flexible with ReadyAPI. And by that, I mean, you can run your tests in different types of pipelines, Jenkins, Bamboo, Azure, run them in Docker containers, run them in virtual machines. So execution is quite flexible, and we'll talk about that in more detail in a second as well. Now, I mentioned earlier that we're seeing more developers start to show an interest in ReadyAPI and leveraging it and using it as part of their day-to-day. And some of the reasons for that, you've probably all heard the term shift left, the idea that more parts of the development lifecycle are moving further to the left. So tasks or phases that would have traditionally been, if you picture left to right, to the right of the lifecycle, like testing obviously is the big one. They're now moving to the left and becoming the responsibility of the developers who are actually writing the code and building the APIs and building the applications. And with that in mind, devs are finding that they need more functionality for testing that they can use quickly, that they can use easily. And ReadyAPI can fit into that role pretty well. And obviously, there's always going to be a need for dedicated testers on a team, and ReadyAPI is quite good at collaboration, right? So if you have a team of testers and developers who are working together, sharing their code, ReadyAPI with things like the Git integration make it easy to put that code somewhere that everyone can use it, whether you're a developer or a tester, and get work done very quickly. So something that SmartBear does every year is the State of API report. And you can find this report on our website if it's interesting. And the State of API report is basically a report that we run when we talk to various API practitioners. So that could be developers, testers, architects, business analysts, pretty much anyone who's involved in the API development process in some way. And we ask them about their challenges. What are they seeing in the market? What do they need to do? What could be better? And we compile all of that into the State of API report. And one of the questions that we asked last year was, what tools do you use to develop high quality APIs? And you can see the top two results there. Number one was source control tools like Git, and number two were CI/CD tools, right? So two developer tools, right, traditionally, but they're now more important to be able to work into your testing processes as well. So to be able to share your test code in a Git repo easily, and to be able to execute your tests in some kind of CI/CD pipeline, regardless of what type of CI server you're using. And the good news is that ReadyAPI can work with both those types of systems very easily, which we'll talk about in a second. And the last thing I want to talk about before we actually look at the tool is, so a lot of you maybe have heard of or used SoapUI open source in the past, and SoapUI open source is kind of the origin of ReadyAPI. So SoapUI open source is still very widely used, very useful, and it's a great API testing tool. But this is just to show you some of the differences between SoapUI open source and ReadyAPI. So what can ReadyAPI do that SoapUI open source can't? And you can see here things like multi-protocol support, supporting different types of specifications. There's more test automation functionality in ReadyAPI, things like refactoring, things like data-driven testing. You're going to get better reports with ReadyAPI. And of course, there down at the bottom, you can see ReadyAPI has a lot more integrations out of the box with SDLC tools, which will make it much more useful for developers and testers who are working in environments with different types of tools. So with all that said, let's actually start to take a look at the tool and get an idea of what it can do. So this is ReadyAPI for anybody who has not seen it before. It's as you can see, it's a desktop application. It is an application that's going to be downloaded and installed in the tester or developer's environment. And like I said, test creation and the work that you do in ReadyAPI is going to happen in this interface, right, in this type of view. And you can see already something I mentioned earlier, that you can jump straight in and start using ReadyAPI in any of the ways that are going to be useful for your team. You can start creating functional tests, creating load tests, or creating virtual services very quickly. Or if you want to start doing, kind of examining the API that you want to test, you can use the Endpoint Explorer to send a request quickly, see a response, and decide if you want to create a test out of that endpoint. And I think a good way of understanding ReadyAPI is, if you open the tool for the first time, how do you actually start creating tests? What do you need as input to start creating projects? And you can think of it like, if you have an endpoint for your API or a list of endpoints, that's one option for creating your first tests. Or if you have an API definition, that's another good way to start setting up your projects. So for a tester using the tool for the first time, the question to ask is, what information do I have about the API that I want to test? Because with that information, you're going to start creating your project. So everything that you do in ReadyAPI is contained in a project. And that's going to be your APIs, your functional, security, and performance tests, and any of your virtual APIs. And all of that is stored as an XML file or several XML files. And that's an important point for collaboration, because if you're using the Git integration, for example, and you're storing your projects in a Git repository, what you're storing are XML files, right? So you can push and pull your functional tests, from ReadyAPI and save them in a GitHub repo, for example. And what's actually getting saved is an XML file. So that's what a project is in ReadyAPI. And when you're creating a new project, the first thing you're going to need is an API to actually test. And you have three main options here. You can import an API definition, you can create an API definition, or you can discover an API. So if I go to import an API definition here, I have three options here in my tab. I can import a definition file from my local machine, I can import from a URL, or I can import a definition from Swagger Hub, which is our API design tool that we mentioned earlier. So Swagger Hub stores open API definitions files that you can then import into ReadyAPI and use to create your tests. So that's one option, but you can just take a file from your computer or from an external URL and use that to create your first API. And you can see here that the protocol support means you can import a REST, a WADL definition, a WSDL definition, GraphQL schema, or async API definition. So there's multi-protocol support. You could potentially have a ReadyAPI project that's testing a REST API, a SOAP API, a database. ReadyAPI really is kind of an integration testing tool or an end-to-end API testing tool. And you'll see what I mean by that in a second when we look at an actual project that we've created. And I can open up an example project here. And when you import an API into your project, you'll see it under the API node, and you'll see all of the operations and resources and requests that you can work with that API, right? So my e-commerce API definition had 4 different resources. And if I navigate to those resources, I can see the requests that I can use to interact with those resources. So at this level, you're looking at things like the endpoint, the parameters, the request. You can start to send requests and see example responses. So it's all very visual, right? It's quite intuitive. It's pretty easy to get started with ReadyAPI in this way because everything is in front of you in the user interface. And like I said, you could potentially have, my REST sample project here just has one API. I could have several APIs and create test cases that use endpoints from each different API, right? So you have those options there. And when you're at the project level here, you can do things like create different environments. There's an environments manager. So, if you want to run your tests in different environments, you can create them here. So maybe you have a dev environment, maybe you have a test environment and a staging environment, and you can change the endpoint for each environment here so that you can easily move or point your tests to different environments as you need to, right? And that's pretty useful to be able to do because most testers and developers are going to be working in a scenario where there's different environments that they need to run their tests in. And ReadyAPI makes it easy to configure those environments and then move between them for your functional tests. So if I look at one of my functional tests here, let's take my integration test, for example, and I'm in my default environment at the moment, which is localhost 8084, that's where my API is. But if I change to dev, that endpoint changes here and it changes in all of my subsequent requests. So it's a good way to switch environments, and maybe you want to create your tests in test or staging and then run them in dev. You can do that pretty easily using the environments manager. Or one other important point about ReadyAPI is that you can use scripts to do a variety of things. So you could write a script that changes the environment as part of the test, and you can run a loop. So run your test once in dev, run it in test, and you can do that by using the Groovy script test step. So your test steps are the building blocks of your test cases, right? A ReadyAPI test case contains multiple test steps, and those test steps are what you see here. So different types of requests with different types of protocols, data source related steps. So if you need to connect to an external data source and use that as part of your test data, steps that change the flow, integrations with Test Complete, for example. So I know you had a Test Complete webinar recently. You can integrate a ReadyAPI test with a Test Complete test and run a front-end test that calls a back-end test, or vice versa, right? So we're really thinking about end-to-end and integration testing here. And the point is that this is quite easy. You don't need to script in ReadyAPI if you don't want to, but if you do want to script, there's plenty of support for that too. So, you could have things like, it's possible to encode attachments using Groovy script, or, if you want to write a script to rerun some failed test cases, there's various ways to do that. And, if you look up on our community forum, there's a page that relates to commonly used Groovy script libraries. And there's a lot of useful stuff in there if you think you're going to use ReadyAPI for scripting. But the point is that you could have a team of scripters, or a team with a scripter on it, and a team with a tester on it who just wants to use the out-of-the-box functionality. And both of those people can work together pretty comfortably in ReadyAPI. So if I go back to my test suite here, and maybe this is a place to make some comparisons between the open source tool and ReadyAPI and the Pro tool. So you can see I have 3 test cases here. My first test case is called simple login call, and it has 3 test steps. We're starting my service, sending a request that logs in, and then stopping my service. And the service that we're using here is a virtual API. So this is part of the API virtualization component of ReadyAPI. So you can see I've got a virtual API standing in for my e-commerce service, right? And that's configured in ReadyAPI and deployed in ReadyAPI. And the idea here is that, just to give you an example of some use cases, if you think about parallel testing, or you think about a development lifecycle where you've got, maybe the test team don't get access to the API until very late in the process, and they have to run a lot of tests and write their tests in a very short space of time. So the idea with virtualization is that as a test team, you can create a mock version of your API that you can write your tests against. And then when the real API becomes available from the developers, you can just move those tests or run those tests in the developer environment instead of your virtual environment. So you're saving time. And that's one of the use cases for API virtualization here, is saving time for testers and letting them start doing their work earlier in the process. And it's also something that's going to be useful for example, front-end developers. So if you're building the front end of your application and you need access to an API that you're going to consume, and that API isn't ready yet, you can use ReadyAPI to simulate the back end and simulate the API behavior so that you can build your front end using that mock behavior, and save you time and save you having to wait for the development team to have all of the back end functionality complete. So that's just a little bit about the virtualization side of things, and we can talk about that more in a minute if it's interesting. But from a functional testing point of view, I have a test case here that's using a virtual API. Okay, so if I run this test case has failed. Why has that failed? It's failed because I'm in the wrong environment. So we'll go back to the correct environment, which is localhost 8084. And we'll run that again, and that will pass. So how do I know it's passed? It's passed because my assertions have passed. So your assertions are, anyone who's used SOAP UI open source will be familiar with the concept of assertions. You add assertions to your responses, and the assertions decide, is this a good response or a bad response? So in this case, my assertion is checking the HTTP status code in the response. And the assertion says that the 200 code is the only valid code. And because the 200 has come back here, my assertion has passed. So very straightforward. And the thing with assertions in ReadyAPI is that in SOAP UI open source, you need to script your assertions. So you need to write JSON path or XPath expressions to actually create assertions. In ReadyAPI, you can point and click to add your assertions to your test. So let's say I want to check that the session ID is always present. I can right click on it, add an assertion for existence. And you can see that ReadyAPI generates the JSON path expression, generates the expected result. I can hit save, and I've got another assertion added here. So in short, it's quicker. It's quicker and easier to add assertions in ReadyAPI than it is in SOAP UI open source because there's more of them, and there's more of them available by default out of the box. So if I open up my assertions menu here, I can see the various types of assertions that I can add. You can script assertions if you want to as well. That's another thing to point out. If you need an assertion to check something that you don't see available out of the box, you can write a Groovy script or a JavaScript to check that, right? Or a JavaScript script. You also have security assertions. So this is another one of the components of ReadyAPI that I mentioned earlier. So the sensitive information exposure assertion checks the response of the API to see, is there any information or file extensions about the source control tool, for example, or the database that's being used, or is there a file called passwords visible in the response? And based on the results of that assertion, you're going to find out if that endpoint or if that test case is secure or not. That's one security scan. You'll find the rest of them here in the security tests module. And they're based on some of the OWASP top 10 web application vulnerabilities. So you've got boundary scans, you've got some fuzzing scans, checks for weak authentication. And the key point here is that I can reuse my existing functional test case. So you write your test case once as a functional test. I can reuse it as a security scan. I can reuse it as a performance test as well, right? So that means, again, you're going to be able to get more work done quicker using ReadyAPI because you can reuse your scripts or your test cases once you have them. And another point that's worth making is that if you're already using SOAP UI open source and you already have some open source projects, you can convert those or import them into ReadyAPI and use them here, right? So a SOAP UI open source project will work in ReadyAPI. The other way doesn't work, but open source to pro, you can do that, no problem. So that was a very simple test case showing you what an assertion looks like. The integration test here shows you property expansion. Property expansion means how can I move data or share data around my test case? So my first test case there was pretty simple. It was just one request, log in, get a response, job done. For my integration test, I've got more requests in sequence, and I need them to work together. I need them to use the same data for the test case to be functional. So in this case, I want to take my session ID and I want to pass that into my subsequent test steps. And to do that, it's very simple. I can right click it and go to transfer to and transfer to whichever parameter or field I want to move that value to, which in this case is my second step here, search item. So search item has a request parameter called session ID, and this is now a variable. So this is checking the login response and pulling the value from there to use in the subsequent request. And that just means that it's easy to make test data dynamic in ReadyAPI, because realistically, if you're running, API tests or integration tests, end-to-end tests, you're probably going to be using dynamic data, or you're going to want to be able to reuse test cases with different types of data. So ReadyAPI makes that easy using things like property expansion, number one, and then also data-driven testing is the third of the kind of three key fundamentals of testing in ReadyAPI. So what this test is doing is connecting to an external data source, using that data to populate my request, and looping around the data source so that I can make use of all the data in the data source value. So if I go up here, you can see there's a loop in place here. So we're going to connect to the data source, log in, log out, kick in the loop, and take the next row of data from the data source. So that's just a way of, again, getting more testing done faster with more different types of data. So if I go here, I can see the username is a variable, the password is a variable. And if I go up to the test case level and go into my transaction log, I can get some lower level information about the execution of the test. So I can see the first login call took 6 milliseconds, it passed. And if I click open, I can see the data that was sent and the data that was received in the response. And I can move through my transaction log so I can get a closer look at all of the steps in my test case. So the logs and the audit trail in ReadyAPI is better and easier to access than what you have in SoapUI open source. In SoapUI open source, you have a pretty straightforward log. In ReadyAPI, you have the transaction log, but you also have reports. So if I go up here to my report button, I can see that I can generate a PDF report. I can generate a JUnit style report for automation. I can run a data export, so pull the data in XML or CSV. Or there's an integration with Allure, which is an open source test reporting framework. And I can use that to generate a nice dashboard view of my results. So the PDF report, for example, that's going to look like this. Starts off at a high level with information about the project and the test case. And as you move through, you'll see test step results, what passed, what failed, what parameters were used. This is a good one for sending to stakeholders. So if you have, non-technical people who need to know what the status of testing is, the printable PDF report is a useful one. If you're running these tests in Jenkins or in an automation, then you might use the JUnit style report or the data export. So you have options for how you want to parse the results and send the results of these tests. So I mentioned earlier that you can take a functional test and convert it into a security test. You can do the same thing for load testing. So your load testing node here relates to your performance tests naturally. So if I go to add a load test, I'll put it this way. A very common scenario that we find talking to customers is a team is using one tool for their API functional tests and a different tool for their load tests, which means that they have to rewrite their functional test scripts as performance tests. So maybe you're using SoapUI open source for functional testing and you're using JMeter for load testing. And that means you're going to have to duplicate some of your scripts or refactor them in some way. In ReadyAPI, once you have a functional test case, you can use that for security testing and you can use it for performance testing. So for my login test, if I want to find out what happens when 10 people try and log in at the same time, I could create a stress test that has all of my parameters pre-configured. I can go ahead and choose my target, which is my login call. And let's say I want to simulate 10 simultaneous users for now. You can also add server monitors in your load tests. So you can see the different types of monitors you can add here. And this just means you can pull information about a Windows or Linux server, a database server, a web application server, and you can include that data in your reports. So you have a load test that's showing you kind of information about the functional performance of your API, but you're also seeing information about the infrastructure or the hardware that's running your API as well. So you've got some non-functional testing information too. And that's the test, or that's the load test monitoring. So I'll skip that for now. And I don't know if anyone was counting, but that was about 4 clicks to go from a functional test to a load test. So it's really simple. It's really easy. Once you have a functional test case to work with, you can create new scenarios out of it and you can reuse them in different ways. So I can go ahead and, let's just say maybe 20 seconds, and I'll run this load test. And if you remember, this load test was using my virtual endpoint. So if I scroll down here, I can see, so now my virtual API is getting hit by the load test, and the load test is populating some results here. So all of the components of ReadyAPI are very well integrated together. And, I've shown you there a very small example of a common use case, which is, let's say you're a performance tester and you're testing system A, but system A has dependencies on API 1, 2, and 3, okay? But you're just interested in system A. You can use ReadyAPI to virtualize the dependencies. So API 1, 2, and 3 are now a sandbox using the virtualization, and the results of your load test are specifically related to application A or system A. So that's a very common use case for ReadyAPI performance testing and ReadyAPI virtualization together, is that you use the virtual services to stand in for dependencies and you run your load test on the isolated system. And that's something that we see, quite a bit of the time with teams that are using all of the ReadyAPI functionality. And if you only take one thing from that, take that ReadyAPI is not just a functional testing tool. It's an API testing platform that can cover a lot of your different needs, whether it's security testing, performance testing, or virtualization. And the good news is that from an automation perspective, all of this can be very easily put into a pipeline or some kind of automated workflow. And there's 2 ways you can automate your ReadyAPI tests. One of them is with Test Runner. And Test Runner is very simple. It's just a command line version of your test. And if you right-click on an integration test, for example, and go to Launch Test Runner, once you configure it and go to Get Command Line, you have a command line argument that you can put into a Jenkins project or put into pretty much whatever your CI server or automation server is. As long as it knows what to do with a command line argument like this, which most CI tools do, you can execute your ReadyAPI tests as part of a workflow or as part of a pipeline very easily. As long as the automation server has access to the project files, usually through the Git integration, you're going to be able to run your tests in this way. That's one approach. The other approach, which is more, what will we say? Let's call it the more modern approach, is to use Test Engine. So Test Engine is a slightly more recent addition to the SmartBear toolset, and it's a test executor for ReadyAPI. It's a test server, basically. So I've got Test Engine running here in the cloud, and I can send functional test project from ReadyAPI to Test Engine using the Test Engine API, and then Test Engine executes those tests and gives me the results. And I can download the results directly from Test Engine instead of getting them from ReadyAPI. And it's just a more effective way of running your ReadyAPI tests. Instead of having a ReadyAPI instance in your automation server, you've got a Test Engine instance, and Test Engine has been built and developed to be more of a server type application. Test Engine also knows how to prioritize your jobs and how to override the queue. So you can tell Test Engine, this job is a priority, put this to the top of the queue using the API. But the main thing is that, as always, you have options, right? There's more than one way to automate your tests using ReadyAPI, whether you want to use the test runner approach or whether you want to use the Test Engine approach. It all depends on what the context is, right?